Hi, I'm Jess, and I am going to introduce this webinar that we're doing about how digital technology can reduce carbon emissions in the Welsh public sector. This is based on a discovery project that we are doing. So I work for a company called Parago, and we're working with another company called MSpark to do this discovery with CDPS. So before I tell you what we're going to be covering today, I'll just tell you a little bit about that discovery. So what we're looking at is where the opportunities are for CDPS to better support people working in the Welsh public sector to be using digital technology in a way that aligns with reducing carbon emissions to meet Wales's net zero commitment by 2050. And there's two sides of that problem that we've been looking at over the past few months. So one side is about how we don't currently have a clear shared understanding of how digital and technology can be contributing to reducing carbon emissions and meeting that net zero aim. So part of what we've been doing is looking at what is good practice in this space, what does good look like? And then the other side we're looking at is that we don't think public servants in Wales have got the right support to be implementing that best practice. So what we've been doing there is speaking to people working in various different roles across the Welsh public sector to find out if this is something they're thinking about, if so, what they're doing, are there any challenges for them to be doing this stuff? And then that will all feed into helping make some decisions at the end of this project about what the most useful things CDPS could be doing are. So that's what our discovery has been focusing on. And what we'll be doing today is we'll be sharing some of our project findings and some of the things we've been doing for the first half. So this will be Corey and Carwyn talking a bit about what good practice looks like in this space. And then we'll be sharing a little bit about that research we've been doing with people working in the Welsh public sector and some of the things that we've been hearing initially there. And then in the second half of the webinar, you'll be pleased to know we want you all to get involved. Hooray, you will say. So we've got a couple of questions for you about what you see as the opportunities and the obstacles to doing this in your context. So we'll probably be doing some breakout rooms there for some little discussions, and we've got a Google Doc that we want everyone to be adding some content to, if that's okay. And then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for some questions if you have any. And if you have any throughout and you just want to pop them in the chat, also please do, and we can pick those up either then or at the end. So that's what we'll be covering. And this is the team that are working on this project. Not everyone is here today, but you will see several people here. So you'll be hearing from Corey, who's the Strategic Design Director at Parago, Carwyn, who's Digital Innovation Manager at MSpark, and me, and I'm the Service Design and Research Lead at Parago. And is there anything else anyone from the project team wants to add before we get into the content? Nope, we're all good. So I'm going to hand over first to Carwyn, who's going to zoom us out a bit and talk about some big picture stuff.
Yeah, so as part of the work on the project, we spoke to a number of organisations, individuals that have got lots of experience in this field to find out, what they think is good practice, but in particular how they think about the challenge. So I think what I'm trying to do here is zoom out all the way out to figure out what are the critical ways of thinking about this challenge that are important for us to bring into this as we consider the rest of what you'll hear today. Next slide, please, Jess. So one of the key things we found is that there's two very fundamental, different perspectives on this. And the solutions, the problems and challenges of each are quite different. The first is to think about the sustainability of the technology, of digital technology itself. The second is to think about how digital technology can be used for the broader sustainability aims of what we're trying to do. Next slide. So the easy one, if you like, is the sustainability of the technology itself. I say easy because a lot of things line up for this one. So as you improve the cost, the performance tends to get better, and coincidentally, the carbon footprint also tends to go in the right direction. So when we were speaking to Adam Turner from DEFRA, for example, who's leading on the work for UK government in this space, this is where they're focusing at the moment, because there's a significant impact that can be made by addressing this side of it, but it tends to be the easier part of it. Everything tends to go in the right direction together. The other key part about this is that it tends to sit within a single department or a single organisation. Everything they need to make the case and get it through tends to be in one part of the organisation. Basically, everybody's in agreement. Next slide. The other way of thinking about this, for how you use digital technology for sustainability, is quite different. It tends to cross departmental boundaries. It tends to also cross organisational boundaries. So there are different parts of organisations that need to be consulted and agree to enact change in this area. But it's also full of compromises. So very often you'll find that one of the cost or the user experience will tend to be something that might go the wrong way, might get worse as you try and address the carbon footprint of a service. I think Corey's got some examples of that later on. It is really, for this side of it, about service design. It's how you design and present the service you're trying to provide to the world is something that you need to think about when you're trying to bring the digital technology into that together. It is much harder to make the business cases because of the complexity of different people involved. One of the people we spoke to, Lewis Dunn, over at part of the Cabinet Office, was looking at the impact of legacy systems on this challenge. So, you're dealing with old equipment, old services, old skills, but in particular, old assumptions. If you pass on to the next slide, I'll talk about a little bit about these. So one of these compromises, these balances that often needs to be considered when you're looking at the best practices, when is it more expensive to stick with the old than to move to the new? Not just from a cost perspective, but from a carbon perspective. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly when that is the case, but it is almost always the case in the legacy systems that Lewis was talking about. So actually understanding and admitting that the old thing is not always the best thing, and there needs to be a change, but it may be a significant change to bring the overall best solution. So procurement has an impact on this. These long phase procurements that are traditional in sort of IT tend to be part of the issue, and the customizations that organizations bring in to do their thing their way can actually act as anchors to keep those legacy systems around for longer. So again, service design, how these things were built and put out there in the first place, can have an impact on how difficult they are to get rid of or improve later on. Next slide. Something was very interesting to hear about, speaking to some of the companies involved, was to frame this whole thing as a risk analysis or risk assessment exercise, to actually build it in to the business continuity, business strategy from a risk perspective, because the evidence does show that it will cost more to deal with this later. To do this, it's probably easiest to do this. These are just referring to the conversations we had. So try and embed the net zero considerations into everything. Think of it as a cost, think of it as a risk, which you would tend to do in most projects, and embed this in all those cases. It seems to be quite effective from what people were saying. Next slide. When we asked some of these organisations that are active in this space, both as leading the pack, showing the way, and providing services to customers in the public sector, what was your biggest challenge? What is the biggest challenge you face when trying to sort of move towards this net zero? Culture is actually it. It's about embracing the changes that are required. It's about taking ownership of the challenge that we need to take on, and breaking through some of these silos of departmental organisations, because it will take breaking through these and then collaborating to get these things through and changed for the better. Ultimately, it's about encoding these guidelines, these rules and policy, but for them to act as a supporting role to help people make these changes. Next one. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the examples of what good might look like. So what exactly did we find? Some of these examples. So next slide. Ultimately, my colleague Debbie was having a conversation about this yesterday. It's about hitting these big hitters. It's the transport, heating and electricity, but from a digital perspective. These are the big ones that somehow we need to address. Next slide. And part of that is to measure rather than just estimate. So if we go through the next couple of slides quite quickly, Jess, I'll just skim through them. To have something that presents to you what your current state of affairs is. Where are you in terms of your carbon footprints? Next slide. For that to be an ongoing thing that you can visualize. This example here is month by month showing how your carbon footprint performance is embodying itself in your service. To make that visible, to measure it as opposed to guessing, not annual cycles, but much, much more up to date is what best practice looks like in this world. There's the last part of this, Jeff. And once you have that measurement, this trend analysis, you can then project forwards to plot the path towards net zero. So many of the cloud providers out there are already providing these kinds of tools. Some of these are now becoming available within organizational sort of on-premise services as well. But literally to be able to look at your projections, just like we would a financial forecast, to look at it from the perspective of what is your carbon emissions forecast? How actually are you going to get there? And to look at it from that perspective. But a few last examples here, Jess, if we go to the next one. So two examples from data center work. So it's a bit on the tech side rather than the service side, but where you end up with conflict. So one example, there's two examples of this in North Wales actually. Two organizations trying to do the right thing by making their data centers more environmentally friendly, lowering the carbon footprint by moving away from air conditioning, putting big fridges in these rooms, and trying to use the air from outside to just cool these very warm rooms. So pulling air from the outside, mixing it up, putting it through these very warm machines and pushing it back out again, rather than putting chillers in there. The catch was, in both these cases, these organizations were quite close to the sea, and the sea air, the salts in the air, was actually a problem over time, causing corrosion in the actual machinery. So there's a lot of balancing acts, bigger picture compromises that need to be considered when trying to take these things on. So sometimes the right thing is not always the easy thing. The last few examples, Jess, last slide. So some good examples of things we found in these conversations with best practices people. Councils advocating for doing more than one thing at once. If you have a refuse collection vehicle going around collecting the refuse, what else can it do on that journey? So because things like putting sensors on these things to check the state of the road, or air quality assessments, things like this, goes back to that aim of removing transport. Well, do more things at once with the same journey. But local council and the university doing very good things in terms of switching things off. So without buying any hardware, without doing anything in terms of real expenditure, just configuring their systems, their desktop, laptop, printers, their IT footprints to switch itself off overnight. This is something that the IT departments can do quite easily. Why not? Some of these things are very easy. There's a classic example that's come up a few times of the things we didn't want to cover about sort of printing and paperless. But actually, there's one example that stood out for me about how when an organization was moving towards more efficient printing and trying to push the paperless agenda, the single action that had the biggest effect was actually to put the printers at the end of the corridor, to force people to walk down the corridor to collect their printing, rather than putting it in the offices. So it's not the obvious change that will actually have the biggest impact, and that's actually more of a behavior change than anything else. DVLA, we heard about this example of removing ink and paper by getting rid of the tax discs, but actually the biggest impact is removing the transport, and not just the delivery of the tax disc to the household. It's things like the actual transport of the paper and ink to the production facilities as well. So that digitization of services make quite a difference there. Last example, speaking to the Welsh Government last week, they asked the supplier, can you make this net zero? And they said yes. It can be as simple as just asking the question. So I'll pass over back to you, Jess, I think. You've
got one more slide.
Oh, what's the last one? I've got one more. So it had to be good. This is a summary slide. So from the best practices conversations, the sort of the highlights, if you like, were to encourage a culture that embraces this and allows and supports the changes that we need to make, to recognise and support the champions that are already being quite vocal about this, and to really step back and think about this from a systems thinking or systems engineering perspective. What is the whole? How are the things interacting? And how are you going to enable those interactions to happen? There you go.
Thank you, Carwyn. So if anyone's got any questions for Carwyn, please chuck them in the chat and we can pick them up. We're going to do a very swift and seamless screen sharing changeover that no one's going to notice.
We're going to try, Jess, aren't we? I'll give you a rest from me saying next slide over and over and over again. Let me see if I can do this seamlessly. Sure. Okay.
Nailed it.
Amazing. I didn't even have to say anything. So hi, everyone. I think Jess said at the start, I'm Corey Hughes. So I am Strategic Design Director at Parago. What that means in practice is looking at how we can use a design mindset. So approaches like empathy, for example, prototyping and testing, and apply them to big world challenges, which Tech Net Zero is definitely one of them. I think putting the word net zero next to digital probably strikes fear into the hearts of a lot of people working in the public sector. And I wanted to acknowledge the fact that this conversation around using digital to contribute to helping us reach net zero target is a discussion that's still in its infancy, right? So everyone here, the team who are working on this project, those of you who are out there listening, will be at different stages of this journey, and we all have different levels of expertise, insights, and knowledge. So what I'm going to share with you now is by no means a finished product. There aren't just 10 ideas out there, I'm sure, for designing net zero digital services, but these are some of the things that we have found as we've explored the wider world, as Carwyn's talked about, and some of the great work that's happening at the front lines of digital public service design. So I wanted to share these with you, a bit of food for thought today. It'd be great to hear in the breakout rooms whether anyone's tried these ideas already or seen good practice happening in the organizations that you work with. So without further ado, 10 principles that I've split into 3 sections. So now what I mean by this are things that you will be able to do without a huge amount of investment financially. So they are conversations that can be started. They are techniques or tools that you could take away today, talk to your clients and colleagues about, and just get that conversation happening, raise the visibility of it. Next, these are drawing on areas from user experience and service design, and also rely on conversations with partners and suppliers. So they will definitely be things that require a bit more consideration and a little bit more investment of time and finances. And then finally later, so this is about the more strategic level things that we can be considering when we are designing net zero digital services. Just a little health warning, I have a greyhound in the background who has decided to finish eating his bone and may start barking at any moment. If he does, I might just pause, and Jess, whether you want to take over and do a little bit of your stuff and I can come back, but fingers crossed you'll settle down. So let's start then with the now. Carwyn just said this, I think it's really important, asking about the consequences. So if we don't ask questions, as people who care about this subject, as people who are working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in this area, we never raise the visibility of what it means to design for net zero targets. So a simple question when you are thinking about redesigning or approaching, commissioning new services is to ask what's the consequence, not just for users, but for the environment. And doing that from the outset is going to let you consider the whole ecosystem from the start. It puts the environment, it puts those considerations front and center of a redesign or approaching a new service. So just that simple question is one of the ideas that we have and that we've seen being used really effectively in this space. Next, understanding the carbon footprint of your digital service. Our colleagues at MSpark have huge amounts of knowledge in this, lots of tools and techniques that they're using with businesses in Wales to guide them through. But there are some simple and freely available tools that some of you may have come across. like web carbon calculators, for example. So most services, most digital public services that we design will have a website tucked away there somewhere as a channel. You can go run that through a web carbon calculator, just see what results it gives you. We did this at Parago as well, didn't we, Jess? So we've been having lots of conversations there about what we can do to better support this through our own channels that we put out into the world. And finally then, for the now, those of you that work in communications and those of you who support your colleagues in the communication space, be transparent with your users. As I said, it can feel a bit scary to be going out into the world and talking about this journey, especially as the environment is changing so rapidly all of the time. But share considerations. Can you be candid about your efforts? Can you encourage your clients to be candid about their efforts in this space? So, for example, if you are an organization in the public sector that may have to provide highly visual or data-rich content, visually rich content in order to support service users, could you talk about the way that you're thinking about how that impacts upon the environment? And just starting that conversation in a blog, letting your users know that you're thinking about this is a really powerful way to lead from the front and acknowledge that this is a journey that is about learning by doing and education. So those are just 3 ideas for the right now. What about the next? So lots of us in the digital space will know that we start the redesign of a new service with an audit. So how can we apply the techniques and tools that we already do to contributing to net zero targets? So by auditing and refining the digital service components, so all of the touch points, the channels that your users and your internal teams will interact with as part of the service that you're delivering, we can think about what's making it hard, what's making it distracting for a user to complete their goals. And this is because effectively, the more data we generate, the more energy we're consuming, right? So if we can improve the quality of a user's interaction with our service, those different touch points, and reduce waste, make the journey more seamless, we're also going to reduce the volume of data generated. So it's good to think that we can design better services for users that will be as equally good for the planet just by adopting those user experience principles. So once we've looked at an audit and a refinement of the components, we can start thinking about accessibility. And again, same kind of thread here. Accessibility principles, so the content principles that exist around the guidelines for accessibility, can also be applied to sustainable design. And I mean sustainable design in the sense of offsetting in terms of net zero targets. So extending accessibility principles to all users, again, contributes to this idea of reducing or offsetting the amount of waste that exists within the delivery of the service that we are providing digitally. Another one on the same theme then, to extend this and really hammer it home, is how do we translate good user experience design principles for the environment? These are things like findability. How quickly can a user get to the information that they want to access to complete a task? Are we making sure that we're reducing the number of steps in order to provide a seamless journey? If so, that also means, as I've said, we are contributing to helping the planet effectively by that small technique. Again, optimizing load speed. Could we think about reducing the amount of JavaScript for those out you who are techie in the room? Could we think about optimizing images? Again, there are tools out there and techniques that can help us to do that quite effectively and efficiently. So thinking about how good UX can also meet the sustainability goals of an organization. Last but not least, on the next is scrutinizing web hosting. So most services digitally would now, I imagine, be hosted on the cloud. There may be some that's hosted on internal infrastructure. Carwyn has talked about his chats with AWS. But again, this is a conversation with current suppliers, or guiding your clients to have these conversations, have the confidence to broach this topic with their hosting provider. So is your hosting running on the most tech efficient stack? If not, why not? What about renewable sources of energy? What's powering the hosting, the data centers that Carwyn talked about? There are also green hosting options out there in the world. Now, they're not something that we've tried ourselves at Parago, but there definitely are different options that you can look at out there. I'd be interested to see if any of you have switched to a green supplier. We do it as consumers, don't we, with our electricity, but are we doing it as organizations and interrogating the relationships that we have with our providers? Looking into the future then, the later, the more strategic side of designing for net zero services. Aligning strategic requirements with sustainability considerations. So this goes full circle to that small question about what's the consequences. Right at the very top of an organization, we are looking at purchasing things, commissioning new services, working with suppliers. If our contracts don't put sustainability considerations at the top of the agenda, then it's very hard to systemically change the way that we work and the way that we deliver public services digitally or otherwise. There's some great work that's happening in this space in Wales. So there will be the creation of a centre of excellence for procurement here in Wales that definitely has net zero right at the heart in terms of the new journeys and services that it wants to provide, to educate and to deliver better efficiencies through procurement in this space. So that's a great example of what can be done at a much more strategic level to influence these conversations. Secondly, I am a big fan of the Design Council's new work into Beyond Net Zero, where they set out an agenda that says effectively, we can look at net zero targets right now, but we must have a longer term mindset. And the way to tap into this knowledge is through building internal capability in skills like systems thinking. And that doesn't mean that you have to go out and recruit people into these roles necessarily. This is a journey of uplifting and upskilling people who are already working in this space. So there are 4 key roles that the Design Council sets out in their report that you can check out, and I'll pop it in the chat later. So system thinker, someone that can zoom out, understand the bigger picture. It's not just working on services themselves. Leaders and storytellers. So how do we powerfully communicate our efforts and the contributions that they are making? Designers and makers. So the people that can prototype, make things happen, have the mindset of creating things that can be tested and experimental, innovative processes. And connectors and conveners. So those people that you'll already know in your organization, and maybe you're one of them, who are just great at playmaking, bringing people together, getting the best out of a discussion and focusing that around this big topic that we're all caring about today on this session. Finally then, in terms of the later, co-creation of solutions for developing net zero digital services. So how can we continue to work collaboratively in this space and blending our expertise to have a long-term mindset? So the Tech Net Zero Discovery Commission from CDPS is one example of this. You saw the slide at the start. We have a very broad and multidisciplinary team working on this challenge. And whilst we are in the stage of discovery, we are also thinking about next steps and how to widen the conversation, work in the open, be quite transparent and candid about what we're learning, where we're finding blockers, and how to bring other voices into that discussion. So looking for opportunities to do that, thinking outside maybe of your current working teams and squads to co-create solutions, maybe with academic partners, maybe with private sector, for people who are doing it differently, and encouraging that way of working that we always advocate in digital, but thinking about it in terms of environmental considerations too. That was a whistle-stop tour through the 10 ideas that we're seeing around designing for net zero digital services. As I say, loads more out there. not a definitive list, but certainly a conversation starter. I could see some stuff happening in the chat, which I'll check out as I hand over to Jess, and looking forward to having a discussion about any or all of these later. Thank you.
Thanks, Corey. I will seamlessly reshare my screen. No one will even notice that there was a change. Is that sharing again? Cool. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about how this translates to the public sector in Wales, some of the research that we've been doing, and then we want to pick all of your brains and do a little activity together to see what you will think. So what we've been doing is some research with people primarily in digital or sustainability roles within the public sector in Wales. And what we're trying to find out are who these people are and the sorts of decisions that they're making about the use of digital in their organisation, how digital and tech stuff gets implemented, whether the sustainability people have that influence, whether the digital people are considering it, what experiences people have of considering carbon emissions in that decision making, and typically what does a digital project or a project to reduce carbon emissions look like? Are there any common steps that these projects go through? So trying to get a view of all those things. We're looking at is there any information or advice that people are already going to for sustainability reasons, what they need in order to perform this role and make positive decisions about reducing carbon emissions, and what potential barriers there are for them being able to do this as well. So we've been speaking to a bunch of people, and I've got a few very early findings I shared last week, just to whet your appetite of the sorts of things that we're hearing, but there's loads more that I'm not going to be sharing now, that will be coming out at the end of this project. If you are interested, keep your eyes peeled for that. So a couple of initial findings about some of the things that are preventing people from being able to use digital to achieve net zero. So one being that digital people aren't necessarily aware that this is something they should be doing. They're not linked up to their organisation's net zero ambitions or plans, and it's not something that they can kind of communicate off the top of their head as like how it affects them. Even if they are aware they could be doing it, should be doing it, not everyone is able to articulate how digital could be helping with carbon reduction. So they might think that, oh, I work in IT and it's not really super relevant to me, like it's more of a bigger picture thing, and well, I'm using a laptop, so I am helping, rather than thinking about it in terms of the services that they're building, the ways that digital and tech are being used. Or some people do seem to have a fairly good understanding of there is some potential there, but it is quite hard to articulate, and it's quite a massive thing, and it's hard for them to be like, oh well, yes, it's just X, Y, and Z, and that's reflected in the nature that actually is quite a complex topic. So that's obviously another barrier to them being able to do it. We've got the digital people and the sustainability professionals within an organisation aren't necessarily always as joined up as they could be. So they don't, like digital people might not even know where to go to get that sustainability advice, support, even though it probably is something within their organisation that's there. Or the sustainability people have all these ideas for digital but aren't linked into the way that digital projects and programs get prioritised and run. So that's obviously another barrier. And then a couple more on this slide, which aren't specifically barriers to reducing carbon emissions through digital, but just some of the things that are coming up in general about using digital to achieve strategic aims. So there's obviously the culture change that's needed with this way of working, and people talking about that, and that some of their colleagues haven't got that, that sort of mindset yet, or don't like that sort of change. There's a lack of capacity to do these digital projects often, even if we've got great ideas of savings and goals that can be reached through them. People are saying things like, well, even making our computers work is a bit of a stretch at the moment. So it's hard for them to imagine how digital could be used in this way. And things like when they've had training about digital roles in the past, it's not always super relevant to their context, especially when they work in areas like local government, where the sorts of digital roles that you might have in other organizations, like a specialist in delivery management, a specialist in product management, etc. It doesn't feel super relevant to their context, so it's not always as applicable. So that is very briefly some of the sorts of things that have been coming up, but there is loads more as well. If you have not done this and you're someone that's involved in digital or sustainability in the Welsh public sector, then there's still time for you to complete our survey, which I will post in the chat if I can, if I've copied that right. I'll do it later if it's not going to do it now. No, it's not doing it now. I'll do it later, but there's an opportunity for you to take part in this research. And then what we were going to do next is have a little bit of a discussion around this. So we've got a couple of questions for you, which are, what are the opportunities? So of the things we've covered today, how could you be applying this in your context, either in your organization or if you work supporting other organizations, working with them? And what are the obstacles? So what are the things that you think would make it difficult for you to do this, or from your experiences with public sector in Wales, are there other things that you think could be obstacles? So the way we'll do this is we'll give you all a minute just to have a little think on your own. And then Gemma's going to pop us in some breakout rooms for about 5 minutes to discuss our thoughts. And then we're going to come back together and we're going to try and add it all into a shared Google Doc, which might be slight chaos, but I have faith it will all work fine. So we'll just pause then for a minute, or you'll have a think.
Any questions that you haven't been able to voice in the breakout rooms or in the chat for us before we wrap up the session today, or just maybe thoughts that we haven't covered? I will open the floor.
Will you be publishing a report about this work, or?
Yep, that is going to be one of the outputs of Discovery. So there's a few different things that we're doing at the moment. One is recording progress in Notion. So we should have our good practice research summaries live any moment now, Susan. I think that is the plan, isn't it, into the world? Yeah.
It's not going to be a report like a massive Word document. It's going to be a microsite. So we'll have all of our work on there, how we've arrived at where we are, some more data as well. So, and summaries, all the resources we've looked at. So you'll be able to review it in perpetuity.
And it also means we can keep adding to it, as Susan said, because what we've found in this space is that the conversation is moving on so quickly. Something that's a year old is almost out of date by the time that we're getting to review it. So having it in that Notion space means that we can invite collaboration and contribution. That's how we'll be capturing it. We also have our shows and tells that we do as part of this discovery process too. So lots of different ways for folks to join in and learn what we are learning as we learn it. And we'll keep on giving you updates on that as well. So I think you can follow us on Twitter, Gemma. We have the CDPS live tweets of these sessions. And obviously all of us are out there in the universe. If you want to hunt us down and grab us for a chat, we are happy always to talk about this stuff offline as well.
I got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Is there an opportunity somehow or other to kind of crowdsource? Because there's 22 local authorities across Wales, a lot of health boards and whatever. There's a lot of people that work there. And could we have a call out or somehow or other incentivize something that, we're looking for ideas, because that in itself would be a positive message in that we are working in the open, looking for people's ideas around where they think savings could be done. I know, it could be a large exercise, but, I think there's such a vast area. There's a danger of it happening piecemeal, and it'd be great if it kind of started out on an open basis like that, really.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think you said in our breakout room didn't you, about visibility, and this is it. You know, we found during the discovery that actually getting that visibility and traction, we've hit some blockers on that, which we've been transparent about, and we've unblocked it, but certainly having the ongoing community to contribute to is bound to be one of the things we consider at the end of this discovery. And all of you, obviously, you know, a bit of a cheeky ask, but to help spread the word about this, the more voices we have in the conversation, the better, because what we don't want is to get to the end of a discovery and have anyone say, I didn't know this was happening. I think that's one of the key measures of success for us, is to get that conversation out there and continue it beyond the scope of this phase. So Jess has just popped a link in the chat to the survey that we've talked about in English and in Welsh as well. If you want to click on that and contribute in that way, that would be amazing.
Or share with anyone that you know that works in digital or sustainability in the Welsh public sector.
Any final thoughts or questions from anybody?
I'm going to put a question for people. There's two types of output I can see that we are finding, if you like. One is more high-level strategic, that, you know, might be coming into the organisations from one side. The other is more sort of on the ground practical advice. Does anybody ever thought of, you know, where the priority in that lies? And you attendees, what would be more useful to you? More strategic stuff to get these things on the agenda, or is it more the practical day-to-day stuff that you can pick up and implement, or it might be both? Any thoughts?
I've got thoughts. Yeah, you're saying probably both. All right, that's interesting. I was going to say, well, surely it's on the strategic agenda. It's more about the doing, but maybe not. Rhys, do you want to come in?
Two people saying practical, so this is interesting.
Sometimes these things, especially things to do with climate, actually it's the people on the ground, and the people at not the coal face, the wind farm face, that actually cause the action. If we wait for strategic leaders to do things, sometimes we wait a very long time, and actually there's nothing to stop the push coming from both above and below. Like, people on the ground, developers can start coding in an efficient way now. They don't need to wait for students directly to start doing that. But obviously you do need both in order to get the impact, get the funding needed. But waiting for funding shouldn't be an excuse to stop you doing things today.
Excellent. I think it is for erring on the side of the practical.
What do you think, Carwyn, from your experience?
I think it's both. I mean, the practical, my experience has been the champions in the organisations, and a lot of the best practice conversations are more of the stories come from that side than the top down in practice. But at the same time, the challenges we've had in terms of engaging in conversation suggests that perhaps these conversations are not happening, and certainly the user research that Jess has got suggests that some of these conversations are maybe not happening at that higher end strategic level, or we're not finding them anyway. So I think it is both, to understand why conversations aren't happening, and what is the most practical kind of advice that people need. That combination, I think.
It reminds me of, 15 years ago, advocating for user experience, and having to come at it from both angles. So actually introducing it at a project level, but then making the case to, senior stakeholders that, if we talk to our users, we might get better outcomes for everybody as a result of it. And it's almost that same changing mindset that's happening around this environmental agenda, for sure. It feels very similar to having to advocate from, as you say, Susan, the bottom up and the top down, and meet somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I guess the last thing, there's a topic that has only come up a few times from the best practices, and it's this focus on consumption. And it's tied to the design conversations about the compromises in user experience and things like this. Ultimately, a lot of this feedback we're saying is how to reduce consumption. It's not just about improving services, it's how do you reduce the demand as well. And that's a topic that maybe hasn't come up as much as I expected. Consumption as a consideration.
Which it definitely is in the individual, so in the commercial space. I think I shared a stat last week about commercial, conscious consumerism being worth 41 billion. It's a massive thing. So we as individuals care, and we are very conscious about how we consume. But at an organizational level in the public sector, it's a different conversation. And how do we break out of that? So, make it something that we do in work as well as what we do when we're shopping online. That has brought us to 11:30, which I think is our stop for this session today. So that just leaves me to thank everybody. Thank you for adding your voices and your insights and your knowledge to this conversation. As I say, we've recorded this. If you want to share it with colleagues and so on, you can. Please keep in touch with us. You've got all of the links that we talked about as well, and looking forward to seeing your faces again at a future show and tell. And maybe coming back with some more good practice examples that we can add to our ever-growing live living Notion site that we'll be releasing as part of this discovery. Thank you so much, everyone, for today.
Thanks,
and enjoy the rest of your day.